My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and for the past 8 years, I've called Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California, my second home. Maybe my first home, if I'm being honest about how much time I spend here. I'm a marine behavioral biologist, which means I study how marine animals think, communicate, and interact with their environment. It sounds glamorous when you say it at dinner parties, but most of my days involve standing in observation rooms with clipboards, timing behaviors down to the second, and trying to decode what amounts to underwater conversations. The work requires patience, precision, and the ability to sit still for hours while dolphins do what dolphins do. Some people think marine biology is all swimming with whales and dramatic ocean expeditions. In reality, it's mostly data collection, statistical analysis, and learning to read the subtle body language of animals that live in a completely different sensory world than ours. But I love it. Every single day brings something new, some small insight into how these incredible creatures experience their world. And for the past 2 years, my focus has been entirely on bottlenose dolphins and their remarkable ability to navigate and communicate through sound. The dolphins I work with aren't wild. They're part of a research program here at Scripps, housed in specially designed pools that allow us to study their behavior in controlled conditions. Before anyone gets concerned about animal welfare, let me be clear. These are large, naturalistic environments with filtration systems that maintain perfect water quality, and the dolphins receive world-class veterinary care. Some of these animals came to us after being injured and rehabilitated. Others were born here and have never known life outside this facility. It's not ideal, I know that, but the research we conduct helps us understand wild populations better, which ultimately aids in conservation efforts. The facility itself is impressive. Multiple interconnected pools of varying depths, underwater viewing areas, and sophisticated recording equipment that allows us to capture every click, whistle, and movement. The pools are designed to minimize echoes and outside noise interference, creating an acoustic environment where we can study echolocation with unprecedented clarity. Working here means early mornings, long hours, and the constant sound of water circulation systems, but it also means working with some of the most intelligent animals on the planet. And after 2 years of studying the same group of dolphins daily, I've come to know them as individuals with distinct personalities, preferences, and quirks. Let me introduce you to my research subjects, because understanding this story requires knowing them as more than just data points. Neptune is our dominant male, a 12-year-old bottlenose who's been at the facility for 6 years. He's large, confident, and has this way of positioning himself between the other dolphins and anything he perceives as a potential threat, including me, sometimes. Neptune produces the most complex echolocation patterns I've ever recorded, using sound like a master craftsman uses tools. When he scans the environment, you can almost see him building a 3-dimensional map of everything around him through those rapid-fire clicks. He's curious but cautious, always the first to investigate new objects we introduce to the pool, but always from a safe distance first. Neptune has scars along his dorsal fin from his life before Scripps, and I've often wondered what experiences shaped his careful, methodical approach to everything. Working with him has taught me that intelligence in dolphins manifests as much in what they choose not to do as in what they do. He's deliberate, thoughtful, and seems to understand that he's being studied. Sometimes I catch him watching me as intently as I'm watching him, as if he's conducting his own research on human behavior. Luna is our queen bee, a 10-year-old female who runs the social dynamics of this group with surprising sophistication. She's smaller than Neptune, but commands respect through sheer force of personality and what I can only describe as emotional intelligence. Luna initiates most social interactions, play sessions, feeding behaviors, even conflict resolution between the younger dolphins. Her vocalizations are the most varied and expressive I've ever encountered, ranging from soft, almost musical whistles to sharp, commanding calls that immediately get everyone's attention. She has this remarkable ability to modulate her communication style depending on who she's addressing, gentle and nurturing with the younger dolphins, more assertive with Neptune when establishing boundaries. Luna was rescued as a calf after being separated from her pod during a storm, and she's been at Scripps for 8 years now. Despite her early trauma, or maybe because of it, she's become the emotional center of this group. She's protective, intelligent, and seems to possess an understanding of group dynamics that rivals anything you'd see in primate research. When Luna is calm, everyone is calm. When she's agitated, the entire group feels it. Learning to read her moods has been essential to understanding the overall health and stability of our research pod. Then we have Cisco, a 9-year-old male who occupies the middle ground between Neptune's dominance and the younger dolphin's playfulness. Cisco is what I'd call the group's diplomat. He maintains relationships with everyone, but doesn't challenge Neptune's authority or compete with Luna's social leadership. His echolocation patterns are precise and economical. He uses sound efficiently, without the elaborate scanning behaviors we see in Neptune, or the complex social calls Luna produces. Cisco came to us after a boat strike left him with permanent hearing damage in his right ear, which has made studying his adaptation strategies fascinating. He's learned to compensate by increasing echolocation intensity and modifying his swimming patterns to optimize sound reception. Watching him navigate with this disability has provided insights into the remarkable plasticity of dolphin sensory processing. Cisco is steady, reliable, and serves as a kind of buffer between the more dominant personalities and the younger animals. He's not flashy or dramatic in his behaviors, but he's consistent, which makes him invaluable for establishing behavioral baselines. In many ways, Cisco represents the everyday reality of dolphin intelligence, not the spectacular problem-solving you see in documentaries, but the quiet, constant adaptation that allows these animals to thrive in changing circumstances. Echo is our 7-year-old female, and her name comes from the distinctive pattern of her echolocation calls. Where other dolphins produce relatively smooth click trains, Echo's calls have this unique reverberating quality that makes them easy to identify even in recordings. She's curious, playful, and shows remarkable problem-solving abilities when we introduce puzzle feeders or novel objects to the environment. Echo has never known life outside this facility, having been born here to a female who was later relocated to another research program. This makes her particularly valuable for understanding how dolphin cognition develops in controlled environments versus the wild. Her play behaviors are elaborate and creative. She'll spend hours manipulating objects, creating what I can only describe as games with rules that she seems to modify as she goes. Echo is also the most responsive to human presence, often approaching the observation windows when researchers arrive and seeming to enjoy the interaction. Her social relationship with Luna is particularly interesting. She follows Luna's lead in most group activities, but also challenges her in ways that suggest she's learning to assert her own preferences and boundaries. Echo represents the future of our research program, a dolphin whose entire behavioral development we've been able to document from birth. Marina is our 8-year-old female, the quietest member of our group, but also one of the most observant. Marina tends to hang back during feeding times and social interactions, preferring to watch and assess before engaging. Her echolocation patterns are subtle and focused. She rarely scans broadly like Neptune, instead directing her clicks with laser precision at specific targets. Marina came to us after being found stranded as a juvenile, and while she's physically healthy, she's always maintained this somewhat reserved demeanor. I've learned not to interpret her behavior as antisocial. Rather, she seems to be a careful observer who processes information differently than the more extroverted members of the group. Marina's interactions with the environment are methodical and thorough. When we introduce new enrichment items, she'll examine them extensively before the others have even noticed them. Her relationships within the group are stable but not particularly demonstrative. She maintains friendly but respectful distances. Working with Marina has taught me about individual variation in dolphin personalities and the importance of not assuming that withdrawn behavior indicates problems. She's simply an introvert in a group of extroverts, and her measured approach to everything provides valuable contrast data for understanding the full spectrum of dolphin behavioral patterns. Finally, there's Splash, our 3-year-old male and the baby of the group. Splash is pure energy and curiosity, approaching everything in his environment with the fearless enthusiasm that only comes with youth. His echolocation skills are still developing. You can hear the difference between his somewhat clumsy click patterns and the sophisticated acoustic maps the adults create. But what he lacks in technical skill, he makes up for in persistence and creativity. Splash has this wonderful habit of imitating the other dolphins' behaviors, often with hilarious results as he tries to copy Luna's complex social maneuvers or Neptune's careful investigation techniques. He was born here at Scripps, and watching him grow and learn has been one of the most rewarding aspects of my research. Splash provides insight into how dolphin intelligence develops, how social skills are acquired, and how young animals learn to navigate their acoustic world. His playfulness keeps the entire group active and engaged. Even serious Neptune seems to enjoy Splash's antics. The younger dolphins' interactions with each adult reveal different aspects of their personalities. Luna is nurturing and protective, Echo is playful and encouraging, Marina is patient and tolerant, Cisco is gently instructive, and Neptune maintains a watchful, almost paternal presence. Splash is living proof that learning in dolphins is a social process, happening through observation, imitation, and constant interaction with more experienced individuals. My daily routine with these dolphins has become as predictable as clockwork, which is exactly what good behavioral research requires. I arrive at the facility every morning at 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the automatic feeding systems activate. This gives me time to set up recording equipment, review the previous day's data, and prepare observation sheets for the day's behavioral documentation. The first formal observation session begins at 7 a.m. and runs until 9 a.m. This is when the dolphins are most active and social, making it ideal for documenting their natural interaction patterns. I record echolocation click rates, measuring the frequency, intensity, and duration of acoustic signals each dolphin produces. Social behaviors get coded according to a standardized ethogram: approach, avoidance, play initiation, aggressive displays, submissive postures. Feeding behaviors are timed and documented, including individual feeding strategies and food preferences. Every 30 seconds, I mark the position of each dolphin in the pool and note their activity level. It sounds tedious, but after 2 years, this level of detail has revealed subtle patterns that wouldn't be visible in casual observation. The afternoon session runs from 2 to 4 p.m., focusing on individual behaviors and responses to environmental enrichment. Evenings are for data analysis, equipment maintenance, and reviewing video footage for behaviors I might have missed during live observation. This routine has given me an incredibly detailed picture of normal dolphin behavior in this environment. After 2 years of this daily documentation, I thought I knew everything there was to know about these 6 dolphins. I could predict with remarkable accuracy when Luna would initiate play behaviors, how Neptune would respond to new objects in his environment, which dolphins would be the first to investigate novel sounds, and how their social hierarchies would shift during different activities. I knew that Marina preferred the deeper sections of the pool during early morning hours, that Cisco had learned to compensate for his hearing loss by positioning himself strategically during group activities, that Echo's echolocation patterns became more elaborate when she was excited or curious. I understood Splash's developmental milestones and could recognize the subtle ways the adults guided his learning through their interactions with him. This knowledge wasn't just academic, it was personal, built through hundreds of hours of observation and thousands of individual behavioral records. These dolphins had become familiar to me in the way that family members are familiar. I could read their moods, anticipate their reactions, and notice immediately when something was different about their behavior or demeanor, or so I thought. As I would soon discover, there were aspects of dolphin perception and communication that my carefully controlled studies hadn't even begun to touch. By March 2011, I was confident in my understanding of these animals and their behavioral patterns. I was completely unprepared for what they were about to teach me about the limitations of human knowledge and the sophisticated ways marine mammals perceive their world. March 7, 2011, started exactly like the 427 mornings that had come before it during my 2 years with this research pod. I arrived at Scripps at 6:30 a.m. with my usual large coffee and stack of observation sheets, expecting nothing more than another day of routine behavioral documentation. The morning was typical for early March in La Jolla, cool, with a marine layer that would burn off by mid-morning, and the kind of quiet that settles over research facilities before the day shift arrives. I went through my standard pre-observation checklist: recording equipment functioning, video cameras positioned correctly, water temperature and quality readings within normal parameters. The dolphins were already showing signs of morning activity as the automated lighting system gradually increased illumination in their pools, simulating natural dawn conditions. Everything appeared completely normal as I settled into my observation position at 7 a.m. sharp, pen in hand, ready to begin another day of data collection. I had no way of knowing that this Monday morning would mark the beginning of the most significant observation period of my career. Looking back, I realized that March 7th was the day everything changed, though at the time it seemed like just another routine day of research. The subtle differences I would soon notice were so minor that any other researcher might have missed them entirely. But after 2 years of intensive daily observation, even the smallest deviations from established patterns stood out to my trained eye. The first thing I noticed was Neptune's echolocation pattern during the morning feeding sequence. For 2 years, I had documented his acoustic behavior with meticulous precision, recording thousands of click trains, measuring frequencies, and mapping the timing of his acoustic scanning. Neptune typically produces echolocation bursts in predictable patterns, methodical, evenly spaced clicks when investigating food, more rapid sequences when scanning for potential threats or changes in his environment. But this morning, His clicks were coming at a slightly higher frequency than his established baseline, perhaps 15% faster than his documented average. It wasn't dramatic, we're talking about differences measurable only in milliseconds, but it was consistent across multiple observation periods. I marked it carefully in my notes, checking my equipment to ensure the recording systems were functioning properly. The frequency increase was subtle enough that it could have been attributed to any number of factors: slight changes in water temperature, minor variations in pool acoustics, or simply normal behavioral variation that occurs in any long-term study. But something about the consistency of the pattern caught my attention. Neptune wasn't just occasionally producing faster click trains, he was maintaining this elevated frequency throughout his entire morning routine. After 2 years of studying his acoustic patterns, I had never seen such a sustained deviation from his normal baseline measurements. Luna's behavior during the 7:30 a.m. feeding time also struck me as unusual, though again in ways so subtle that they could easily be dismissed as normal variation. Typically, Luna is the first dolphin to approach the feeding area when our automated systems release fish into the pool. She's assertive about food, not aggressive, but definitely confident in claiming her share, and often directing the social dynamics of feeding time. This morning, however, she hung back near the pool's edge for nearly 3 minutes before approaching the feeding area. I timed it precisely, 2 minutes and 47 seconds of hesitation before she moved toward the food. During those 3 minutes, she remained in position near the eastern wall of the pool, her head tilted at an angle I rarely observe, appearing to listen or scan for something below the pool's bottom. Her echolocation during this period was different too, not the broad environmental scanning she typically does, but focused, directional clicks aimed downward toward the pool floor. Luna's body posture was tense, alert, with her pectoral fins held slightly away from her body in a position I associated with heightened awareness or mild stress. When she finally did approach the feeding area, her movements were more cautious than usual, and she continued to pause periodically to direct those focused echolocation bursts toward the bottom of the pool. I documented everything carefully, noting timestamps and behavioral details, but struggled to interpret what I was observing. There was nothing in Luna's environment that should have triggered this cautious, listening behavior. The behavioral changes weren't limited to Neptune and Luna. As I continued my morning observations, I noticed that Cisco and Echo were swimming closer together than their normal social distance patterns would predict. Over 2 years of documentation, I had established clear measurements for individual space preferences in this pod. Each dolphin maintains preferred distances from others during different activities, closer during play, farther apart during rest periods, with specific patterns for feeding and environmental exploration. Cisco and Echo typically maintain a social distance of 3 to 4 meters during morning activities, coming closer for brief interactions, but generally respecting each other's individual space. This morning, however, they were consistently staying within 1-2 meters of each other, moving almost in synchrony as they navigated the pool. Their swimming patterns were more coordinated than usual, with Echo appearing to follow Cisco's lead in ways that deviated from their established social dynamics. When I checked my notes from the previous week, this level of sustained close proximity had occurred only twice before, both times during brief play sessions. But this wasn't play behavior. They were swimming with purpose, alert, and focused, maintaining their tight formation for over 20 minutes. Marina and Splash showed similar subtle changes, with Marina positioning herself closer to the younger dolphin than her typical solitary patterns would suggest. The overall effect was that the pod appeared more cohesive, more alert, more attentive to something I couldn't identify. What struck me most about these behavioral changes was their subtlety and their consistency across multiple individuals. In behavioral research, you learn to distinguish between random variations and meaningful patterns. Random changes are typically isolated, one animal showing slightly different behavior on one occasion, easily explained by individual factors like health, mood, or environmental conditions. Meaningful patterns involve multiple individuals showing coordinated changes that persist across time and context. What I was observing on March 7th felt more like a meaningful pattern, but I couldn't identify any environmental factor that would trigger such a response. Water quality readings were normal, pool temperature was within optimal range, there were no unusual sounds or vibrations in the facility. I had spent considerable time documenting the dolphins' responses to various stimuli, construction noise, boat traffic, weather changes, equipment modifications, and none of those known triggers were present. The facility's acoustic monitoring systems showed no unusual background noise that might be disturbing the animals. Yet all 6 dolphins were showing subtle but measurable deviations from their established behavioral baselines. As a scientist, I was trained to be skeptical of pattern recognition, to avoid seeing significance where none exists. But my detailed knowledge of these animals' normal behaviors made the changes impossible to ignore. Something was different, and it was affecting the entire pod simultaneously. I spent considerable time that morning double-checking my observation protocols and equipment to rule out any methodological factors that might explain what I was seeing. Sometimes changes in researcher behavior can influence animal responses, arriving at a different time, wearing different clothing, moving differently around the observation area. I reviewed my actions carefully, comparing them to my standard routine from previous weeks. Everything was identical. Same arrival time, same setup procedure, same observation positions. I checked the recording equipment timestamps against my handwritten notes to ensure I wasn't misremembering behavioral sequences. I even reviewed video footage from the previous week to confirm my baseline measurements for comparison. The equipment was functioning normally, my methodology was consistent, and the dolphins were definitely showing behavioral changes. I considered whether the slight change in weather might be affecting their behavior. Marine mammals can be sensitive to barometric pressure changes, but the atmospheric conditions were well within normal ranges for the season. No storms were approaching, no significant weather systems were moving through the area. The ocean conditions beyond our facility were calm, with no unusual wave patterns or tidal variations that might transmit subtle vibrations through the facility's structures. After eliminating all the obvious environmental and methodological factors I could think of, I was left with the conclusion that the dolphins themselves were responding to something I couldn't detect or measure with my standard research tools. My training as a behavioral researcher emphasized the importance of careful documentation over premature interpretation. When you observe unusual behaviors, the first priority is to record everything meticulously and avoid jumping to conclusions about causation. So I focused on documentation, taking more detailed notes than usual, and increasing my observation frequency to capture any additional changes that might develop throughout the day. I documented the exact timing of behavioral changes, measured the duration of unusual postures or movements, and recorded detailed descriptions of vocalizations and echolocation patterns. I took additional water quality readings, checked pool circulation systems, and verified that all environmental controls were functioning normally. The afternoon observation session, from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., showed continued subtle variations from normal patterns, but nothing that escalated beyond the morning observations. By evening, as I reviewed the day's data, I had documented numerous small deviations from established baselines, but nothing that rose to the level of concerning abnormal behavior. The changes were real, measurable, and consistent, but they were also minor enough that they could reasonably be attributed to normal biological variation. Every long-term study includes days when subjects behave slightly differently for reasons that are never fully explained. March 7th could simply be one of those days. However, as I prepared to leave the facility that evening, I found myself lingering longer than usual, watching the dolphins during their evening rest period. There was something about their alertness that continued to nag at me. Even during rest, when dolphins typically show relaxed postures and decreased echolocation activity, the pod maintained a level of environmental awareness that seemed elevated compared to previous observations. They weren't showing signs of stress or agitation. Their breathing rates were normal. Their social interactions remained positive, and they showed no physical symptoms of distress. But they appeared to be listening, scanning, paying attention to something in their environment with an intensity that I hadn't documented before. Neptune continued to produce occasional echolocation bursts directed toward the pool bottom, even during rest periods when he would normally be acoustically quiet. Luna maintained her alert head position, periodically tilting to direct focused attention downward. The younger dolphins stayed closer to the adults than their typical evening patterns would predict. As I finally locked up the facility and headed home, I made a mental note to arrive early the following morning and increase my observation intensity. If the unusual behaviors continued or intensified, I would need to consider expanding my documentation protocols and possibly consulting with colleagues about potential explanations. For now, March 7th would be recorded as an interesting anomaly in an otherwise routine research program. The drive home that evening gave me time to mentally review the day's observations and consider possible explanations for what I had witnessed. Marine mammal behavior can be influenced by factors that are difficult for humans to detect. Infrasonic sounds from distant sources, subtle changes in electromagnetic fields, chemical traces in the water that are below the threshold of our testing equipment. Dolphins possess sensory capabilities that far exceed human perception, particularly in their ability to process acoustic information and detect minute changes in their environment. It's possible that they were responding to stimuli that were completely outside my ability to measure or recognize. Seismic activity, for example, can produce low-frequency vibrations that travel through water long before humans become aware of earthquake activity. Ocean temperature variations, changes in current patterns, or even distant shipping traffic could potentially influence dolphin behavior in ways that wouldn't show up in standard environmental monitoring. Military sonar exercises, sometimes conducted hundreds of miles offshore, have been known to affect marine mammal behavior across vast distances. As I considered these possibilities, I realized that my research focused primarily on the dolphins themselves, with less attention paid to the broader environmental context that might influence their behavior. Perhaps March 7th was teaching me that understanding dolphin cognition requires expanding my perspective beyond the controlled environment of our research pools. By the time I reached my apartment, I had convinced myself that March 7th represented normal variation in a long-term behavioral study, possibly influenced by environmental factors too subtle for my standard monitoring protocols to detect. I made notes to increase observation frequency over the following days, and to expand environmental monitoring to include factors I hadn't previously considered relevant. The scientific method requires patience and skepticism. You document unusual observations, look for patterns, and avoid premature conclusions about significance. One day of slightly different behaviors doesn't constitute a meaningful finding. It constitutes the beginning of a potential pattern that may or may not develop into something significant. As I prepared for sleep that night, I felt confident that I had handled the day's observations appropriately. Careful documentation, thorough methodology review, and reasonable speculation about potential causation. I expected that March 8th would either show a return to normal behavioral patterns or provide additional data points for understanding whatever had triggered the subtle changes I had observed. I had no way of knowing that the minor variations I had documented on March 7th were actually the first signals of the most remarkable demonstration of animal perception I would ever witness. The dolphins weren't just behaving slightly differently. They were beginning to detect something that would soon change my entire understanding of how marine mammals perceive and respond to their world. March 8th hit me like a wall the moment I walked into the facility at 6:30 a.m. Before I even reached the observation area, I could hear sounds coming from the dolphin pools that I had never encountered in 2 years of daily research. The normal background acoustics of the facility, gentle water circulation, distant equipment hums, the occasional soft whistle or click from the dolphins, had been replaced by something urgent and repetitive. As I approached the main observation window, my stomach dropped. All 6 dolphins were already active, not with the lazy, gradually increasing morning activity I had documented hundreds of times, but with intense, purposeful movement that immediately triggered every alarm bell in my research-trained mind. Neptune was positioned near the center of the main pool, producing echolocation clicks so rapidly and consistently that the individual clicks were almost blurring together into a continuous acoustic stream. I had never recorded anything approaching this intensity from him. Not during feeding excitement, not during social play, not even during the few mild, aggressive displays I had witnessed. The sound was relentless. Boom, 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 boom. Like a biological machine gun that never paused to reload. Luna was responding with vocalizations that made my skin crawl, not because they were unpleasant, but because they were completely outside my catalog of documented dolphin sounds from this facility. These weren't her typical whistles or clicks, but low, guttural calls that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her normal vocal repertoire. The physical behavior patterns were equally disturbing and completely unprecedented in my research experience. All 6 dolphins were swimming in tight, clockwise circles in the deepest section of the main pool, maintaining a formation so precise it looked choreographed. This wasn't the loose, social swimming I typically observed, nor was it the individual exploration patterns each dolphin usually followed during morning activity periods. They were moving as a single unit, maintaining exact distances from each other, turning at precisely the same moments, diving and surfacing in synchrony. The formation was so tight that from my observation position, it looked like a single 6-part organism rather than individual animals. Cisco and Echo, who had been swimming closer together the previous day, were now positioned directly adjacent to each other, their movements so coordinated they appeared to be connected by invisible threads. Marina had abandoned her typical solitary position and was integrated into the group formation, something I had never seen her do during my entire research period. Even young Splash was maintaining the tight formation, his usually playful, erratic swimming patterns replaced by the same serious, purposeful movement the adults were exhibiting. The precision of their coordination was unnatural for captive dolphins, who typically show much more individual variation in their swimming patterns and social positioning. Watching them move in this synchronized formation triggered an immediate sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. What made the behavior even more unsettling was its intensity and persistence. I had arrived early, before the automatic lighting system fully activated, and the dolphins were already exhibiting these patterns in the pre-dawn dimness. This suggested they had been active for hours, possibly all night, which contradicted everything I knew about dolphin rest cycles in captivity. Dolphins typically show decreased activity during nighttime hours, with periods of rest and reduced echolocation that allow for physical recovery. But the animals I was observing showed no signs of fatigue or rest behavior. Neptune's echolocation intensity hadn't decreased even slightly since my arrival, and the synchronized swimming continued without any breaks or variations in formation. Luna's unusual vocalizations maintained the same volume and frequency, creating a constant background of sounds I couldn't categorize using any of my established behavioral coding systems. The persistence alone was alarming. Even during their most excited feeding periods or elaborate play sessions, these dolphins typically showed natural breaks in activity, pauses for rest or individual exploration. But March 8th presented me with continuous, unvarying behavior that suggested they were responding to some stimulus or trigger that wasn't letting up. As I began my formal observation documentation at 7:00 a.m., I realized I was witnessing something far beyond the subtle variations I had noted the previous day. I immediately initiated intensive documentation protocols, setting up additional recording equipment and expanding my observation coverage to capture every detail of what was clearly an unprecedented behavioral event. My standard observation sheets were completely inadequate for documenting the complexity and intensity of what I was witnessing, so I switched to continuous narrative recording, describing behaviors in real time as they occurred. I activated all available video recording systems, positioning cameras to capture different angles of the synchronized swimming formation and setting audio equipment to maximum sensitivity to record the full spectrum of vocalizations and echolocation patterns. Within the first hour, I had filled more observation notes than I typically completed in an entire day, and I was still struggling to keep up with the rapid changes and variations in behavior. The dolphin's acoustic output alone was overwhelming. Neptune's rapid-fire echolocation, Luna's continuous unusual vocalizations, and additional sounds from the other 4 dolphins that I couldn't even begin to categorize. Echo was producing echolocation patterns that sounded like her normal calls, but accelerated to double or triple their usual speed. Cisco was making whistles that started in his normal frequency range, but escalated to pitches I had never recorded from him. Marina, typically the quietest member of the group, was contributing her own stream of clicks and calls to the acoustic chaos. Even Splash was adding his developing voice to the collective sound, though his contributions were more erratic and less sustained than the adults. My first priority was to rule out equipment malfunction as a possible explanation for what I was recording. Behavioral research equipment is sophisticated but not infallible, and I needed to be absolutely certain that I was documenting real animal behavior rather than technological artifacts. I spent considerable time that morning running diagnostics on all recording systems, checking calibration on acoustic equipment, and verifying that video timestamps were synchronizing correctly with audio recordings. I tested backup recording devices to ensure I was getting consistent readings across multiple systems. I checked underwater microphones for any interference or signal corruption that might be altering the dolphin's actual vocalizations. Every piece of equipment checked out perfectly. The sounds I was hearing and the behaviors I was observing were genuine, not technological glitches or recording errors. I also verified that the facility's environmental systems were functioning normally, ruling out any mechanical problems that might be creating unusual vibrations or sounds that could trigger the dolphins' responses. Pool filtration, water temperature regulation, lighting systems, and backup power supplies all showed normal operational parameters. The acoustic isolation systems that minimize outside noise interference were working correctly, meaning the dolphins weren't responding to external sounds from construction, traffic, or other human activities. After completing these technical checks, I was forced to conclude that the behavioral changes were real, significant, and unexplained by any obvious environmental or methodological factors. The stress indicators I observed throughout March 8th were unmistakable and deeply concerning from an animal welfare perspective. Elevated breathing rates across all 6 dolphins, muscle tension visible in their swimming postures, and decreased interest in food during normal feeding times all pointed to significant physiological stress. Luna, typically the first to approach during feeding periods, barely acknowledged the presence of fish in the water, continuing her unusual vocalizations and tight formation, swimming even when food was available. Neptune's breathing pattern showed the rapid, shallow characteristics I associated with high stress or agitation, quite different from the deep, regular breathing of relaxed dolphins. The younger dolphins, Splash and Echo, were showing submissive postures toward the adults that I rarely observed, except during serious social conflicts or environmental threats. Marina's normally calm demeanor was replaced by constant alertness and what appeared to be scanning behavior directed toward the bottom of the pool and beyond. Cisco's compensation strategies for his hearing loss seemed to be failing him. Instead of the careful, strategic positioning I usually observed, he appeared confused and disoriented by the acoustic chaos his podmates were creating. The combination of physical stress indicators with the unprecedented behavioral changes convinced me that I was witnessing a significant welfare event that required immediate attention and expanded monitoring protocols. Throughout the day, I consulted with colleagues via phone and email, describing the behaviors and seeking any similar cases in the literature or other research facilities. Dr. Martinez at Woods Hole had never encountered synchronized swimming formations of this intensity in captive dolphins. Dr. Thompson at Miami Marine Institute suggested possible responses to subsonic vibrations, but had no experience with the specific acoustic patterns I was documenting. My former advisor at UC San Diego recommended comprehensive veterinary evaluation, but acknowledged that the behaviors fell outside normal stress responses she had studied. I sent audio files to researchers specializing in dolphin acoustics, hoping someone might recognize the unusual vocalizations or explain the dramatic changes in echolocation patterns. The responses were consistent. Experienced marine mammal researchers found the behaviors as puzzling and unprecedented as I did. This consultation process confirmed that what I was witnessing wasn't a known response to typical captive environment stressors like facility maintenance, staff changes, or routine medical procedures. The behaviors were novel, complex, and apparently unique to this situation. By afternoon, I had expanded my documentation to include continuous video recording and was preparing to implement 24-hour monitoring protocols to track whether the behaviors continued through the night or showed any cyclic patterns that might provide clues about their underlying cause. March 9th brought no relief, and if anything, an intensification of the behavioral patterns that had emerged the previous day. I arrived at the facility before dawn to find the dolphins still engaged in the same synchronized swimming formation, suggesting they had maintained these patterns throughout the night with minimal or no rest. The acoustic intensity had actually increased. Neptune's echolocation was now so rapid and sustained that I could barely distinguish individual clicks, and Luna's unusual vocalizations had developed additional tonal qualities that made them even more unlike anything in my behavioral databases. The tight circular swimming formation had become even more precise, with the 6 dolphins moving as though they were physically connected, turning and diving with split-second timing that would have been impressive in trained performance animals. But these weren't trained behaviors. They were spontaneous responses to something I still couldn't identify or measure. The stress indicators from March 8th had intensified as well, with visible signs of fatigue beginning to appear alongside the continued agitation. Breathing rates remained elevated, but I was beginning to see the deeper, more labored breathing patterns that suggest physical exhaustion. The dolphin's normally sleek appearance was beginning to show signs of stress, slightly raised muscle tension that created subtle changes in their body contours, positioning that suggested discomfort, even while they maintained their coordinated movements. The vocalizations on March 9th evolved into something I can only describe as a constant conversation among the 6 dolphins, but conducted in acoustic patterns that bore little resemblance to their documented communication systems. Luna was still producing the low, guttural calls that had started the previous day, but they were now interspersed with whistles that swept across frequency ranges I had never recorded from her. Neptune's echolocation had developed a rhythmic quality that seemed to synchronize with Luna's calls, creating what sounded like a coordinated acoustic display. Echo was contributing rapid-fire whistles that started and stopped in apparent response to the adults' vocalizations, as though she was participating in a conversation I couldn't understand. Even Marina, whose vocalizations were typically minimal and subtle, was producing sustained calls that added to the collective acoustic output. Cisco's sounds showed the strain of trying to participate in this acoustic coordination, despite his hearing limitations. His calls were less precise than usual, sometimes overlapping awkwardly with the others' vocalizations. Splash's contributions were the most erratic, but even his immature vocalizations seemed to be attempts to match the patterns the adults were creating. The overall effect was of 6 animals engaged in intensive, urgent communication using acoustic patterns that fell completely outside my understanding of dolphin social behavior. I was recording conversations in a language I didn't recognize, conducted by animals I thought I knew intimately. By the end of March 9th, I had documented 2 full days of unprecedented behavior that showed no signs of decreasing in intensity or returning to normal patterns. My observation notes filled multiple notebooks. My audio recordings included hours of vocalizations, unlike anything in the scientific literature, and my video documentation captured swimming formations that challenged basic assumptions about dolphin social behavior in captivity. The animals were clearly under significant stress, but they were also demonstrating cognitive and social capabilities that exceeded my previous understanding of their species. The synchronized swimming wasn't just coordination, it was communication through movement, with each dolphin's position and timing conveying information to the others in ways I couldn't decode. The acoustic patterns weren't just stress calls. They were complex, structured vocalizations that suggested these animals were sharing detailed information about something they were perceiving or experiencing. As I locked up the facility that evening, preparing for what I suspected would be another sleepless night of analyzing recordings and consulting with colleagues, I realized that my research had shifted from routine behavioral documentation to crisis management. Something was happening to these dolphins that fell far outside the boundaries of normal captive animal behavior, and I was completely unprepared to understand or respond to it appropriately. By March 10th, I was operating on 3 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline, frantically reaching out to every marine mammal expert in my professional network. I called Dr. Martinez at Woods Hole at 6 a.m., not caring about East Coast time zones, and walked him through 48 hours of unprecedented behavioral data. He listened to my audio recordings over the phone, his long pauses telling me everything I needed to know. He was as baffled as I was. Dr. Thompson at Miami Marine Institute had never encountered anything similar in her 15 years of captive dolphin research. My former advisor at UC San Diego suggested neurological toxins, but admitted the synchronized nature of the behavior made environmental poisoning unlikely. Dr. Rodriguez at the National Marine Mammal Foundation reviewed my video footage and confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't documented dolphin behavior. I sent detailed behavioral descriptions to research facilities across 3 continents, hoping someone, somewhere, had observed similar patterns. The responses were unanimous. Experienced researchers were as mystified as I was by what my dolphins were doing. The veterinary examinations I ordered provided no answers, and only deepened my frustration with this impossible situation. Dr. Sarah Kim, our head veterinarian, conducted comprehensive health assessments on all 6 dolphins, using minimally invasive techniques to avoid disrupting their already elevated stress levels. Blood chemistry panels came back completely normal. No signs of infection, toxicity, neurological dysfunction, or metabolic abnormalities. Neurological response tests showed typical reflexes and cognitive function, with no indicators of brain trauma or disease. Physical examinations revealed no injuries, parasites, or anatomical problems that might explain the behavioral changes. Heart rates were elevated consistent with stress, but cardiac function appeared normal otherwise. Even their hearing tests, particularly important for Cisco given his previous injury, showed no deterioration in auditory processing capabilities. Dr. Kim's final report concluded that all 6 dolphins were physically healthy despite their obvious behavioral distress, leaving us with no medical explanation for what we were witnessing. I became obsessive about environmental monitoring, testing every parameter I could think of, and several I had never considered relevant to dolphin behavior research. Water quality readings were taken every 2 hours. pH, salinity, dissolved oxygen, ammonia levels, temperature variations, bacterial counts, chemical additives from filtration systems. Everything remained within optimal ranges for marine mammal health. I borrowed seismic monitoring equipment from the geology department to check for ground vibrations that might be transmitting through the facility's structure into the pools. No unusual activity registered on the sensors. Electromagnetic field measurements were taken throughout the facility to rule out interference from electrical equipment or nearby radio transmissions. All readings were normal and consistent with previous baseline measurements. I even had the water tested for trace chemicals that might not appear in standard quality assessments: industrial pollutants, pharmaceutical residues, unusual mineral concentrations. The results showed pristine water chemistry that actually exceeded the standards required for marine mammal captivity. After 3 days of intensive environmental analysis, I had ruled out every water quality or facility-related factor I could imagine. External environmental factors provided no explanations despite exhaustive investigation into potential disturbance sources. I contacted the Coast Guard to check for unusual shipping traffic, military exercises, or sonar activities that might be affecting marine life along the Southern California coast. No operations were scheduled or ongoing that would generate the kind of acoustic disturbances known to affect dolphin behavior. Weather patterns showed typical March conditions for the region: no storm systems, temperature anomalies, or barometric pressure changes that might influence marine animal behavior. I reviewed air traffic control data to rule out unusual aircraft operations that might create infrasonic vibrations. Seismological data from local monitoring stations showed no earthquake activity or geological events that might be transmitting vibrations through the ocean floor. I even checked with nearby construction projects and industrial facilities to verify they weren't operating equipment that might generate low-frequency sounds or vibrations. Every potential external source of disturbance I could identify came back negative, leaving me with healthy dolphins exhibiting unprecedented behavior in an apparently perfect environment. The depth of my frustration was matched only by my growing sense of professional inadequacy as a researcher who couldn't explain what was happening in her own study facility. I had spent 2 years developing expertise in these specific animals, documenting their behaviors with scientific precision, learning to interpret their moods and responses with confidence that bordered on intuition. Now I felt like a beginning graduate student confronted with basic questions I couldn't answer. The dolphins were clearly trying to communicate something urgent, but I lacked the knowledge or tools to understand their message. Every test came back normal. Every consultation yielded no useful insights. Every hypothesis I developed crumbled under scrutiny. I began questioning my own observational skills, wondering if I was misinterpreting normal behaviors because of stress or sleep deprivation. But the video recordings didn't lie. 6 dolphins swimming in perfect formation while producing acoustic patterns unlike anything in the scientific literature was not normal behavior under any circumstances. My professional training emphasized evidence-based conclusions, but the evidence was leading me toward conclusions that made no scientific sense. Late on March 10th, a phone call from Dr. Williams at the local Marine Rescue Center provided the first piece of information that offered both relief and deeper concern about what I was experiencing. She had been receiving reports from beach patrol units, fishing boat captains, and coastal research stations about unusual marine animal behavior throughout the San Diego area. Sea lions were gathering in larger groups than normal and showing elevated activity levels during typically quiet periods. Harbor seals were hauling out on beaches in unusual numbers, displaying restlessness that local wildlife officials couldn't explain. Even the wild dolphin pods visible from shore were showing altered swimming patterns, tighter formations, more synchronized movement, increased surface activity. Dr. Williams asked if I had noticed anything unusual about our research animals, and when I described our situation, she went quiet for a long moment before admitting that multiple marine species across the region seemed to be responding to something they could perceive, but humans could not detect. For the first time in 4 days, I felt a mixture of validation and terror. Validation that my observations were part of a larger phenomenon, and terror about what that phenomenon might represent. March 10th became the longest and most terrifying day of my scientific career, as the dolphins' behavior escalated to levels that made me genuinely fear for their survival. I arrived at the facility at 5:30 a.m., 30 minutes earlier than usual, and found a scene that shattered any remaining hope that we were dealing with temporary behavioral variation. All 6 dolphins were positioned in the shallow end of the main pool, as close to the concrete edge as they could get without actually beaching themselves. This was unprecedented. These animals had never shown any inclination to leave the deeper areas of their environment, and their positioning looked disturbingly similar to the stranding behavior I had studied in wild cetaceans under extreme distress. Neptune, our largest and most dominant male, was actually pressing his rostrum against the pool wall, pushing forward with movements that suggested he was trying to force himself out of the water entirely. Luna was beside him, her breathing rapid and labored, producing vocalizations that I can only describe as screaming, high-pitched, sustained calls that cut through the morning air with desperate intensity. The sound made my chest tight with recognition of distress, even though I had never heard anything like it from captive dolphins. The food refusal that began that morning was complete and absolute, representing a level of behavioral abnormality that immediately triggered every animal welfare protocol I knew. During the 7 a.m. feeding period, I released fish into the pool following standard procedures, expecting at least some feeding response despite their obvious agitation. Instead, All 6 dolphins completely ignored the food, continuing their attempts to position themselves in the shallowest areas possible while maintaining their acoustic distress calls. Luna, who had never missed a feeding opportunity in 2 years of observation, didn't even acknowledge the presence of fish in the water. Neptune's usual methodical approach to food was replaced by continued pressing against the pool walls, his powerful body straining against the concrete barrier, as though something beyond the facility was calling to him. Even young Splash, whose appetite had been consistently reliable throughout his development, showed no interest in eating, instead staying close to the adults and mimicking their shallow water positioning. By 9 a.m., when the automatic feeding system delivered the second food release, the fish remained untouched, floating at the surface while the dolphins continued their desperate attempts to escape their environment. The acoustic patterns that emerged throughout March 10th were unlike anything documented in marine mammal literature and represented a complete departure from everything I understood about dolphin communication. Luna's distress calls had evolved into something that sounded more like a siren than biological vocalizations, sustained, high-frequency wails that lasted up to 30 seconds each before she paused for rapid breathing and resumed calling. Neptune was producing echolocation bursts so rapid and intense that they created a continuous buzzing sound, punctuated by what I can only describe as sonic explosions, single, incredibly loud clicks that seemed designed to penetrate beyond the facility walls. Echo and Cisco were contributing harmonizing calls that created an acoustic environment of such intensity that I had to reduce my recording equipment sensitivity to prevent audio distortion. Marina's typically quiet voice had joined the collective distress symphony, producing low-frequency calls that I felt as much as heard, vibrations that seemed to resonate through the observation room floor. Even Splash's immature vocalizations had taken on urgent, pleading qualities that made me want to help him, even though I had no idea what assistance he needed. The physical attempts at self-stranding became more desperate and coordinated as the day progressed, forcing me to seriously consider emergency intervention to prevent actual beaching events. By mid-morning, all 6 dolphins were taking turns pushing themselves as far into the shallow areas as possible, using their powerful tail flukes to propel their bodies toward the pool edges with dangerous momentum. Neptune made several attempts that brought his pectoral fins completely out of the water. His massive body balanced precariously on the sloping pool bottom while he strained to move further toward land. Luna coordinated her efforts with Neptune's, positioning herself alongside him and adding her strength to his forward momentum in ways that suggested they were working together toward a common goal. The smaller dolphins followed the adults' lead, with Echo and Cisco making their own stranding attempts while Marina and Splash positioned themselves to assist. I realized with growing horror that these highly intelligent animals were collaborating in an escape attempt that could result in their deaths, driven by some impulse so powerful it overrode their basic survival instincts. My concern for their immediate welfare forced me to implement emergency monitoring protocols and consider interventions I had never imagined needing during routine behavioral research. I contacted Dr. Kim for immediate veterinary consultation, describing behaviors that fell so far outside normal parameters that we had no established response procedures. I activated continuous video monitoring from multiple angles to document any further escalation that might require immediate physical intervention to prevent self-injury. The facility's emergency response team was put on standby, with equipment prepared for possible dolphin rescue operations if the stranding attempts became life-threatening. I found myself standing at the pool edge with a long-handled net, prepared to physically prevent the dolphins from injuring themselves, while having no idea what was driving their desperate behavior. The stress of watching these intelligent, normally calm animals engage in what appeared to be coordinated self-destructive behavior was taking a psychological toll that I wasn't prepared to handle. Every instinct I had as a researcher said to document and observe, but every instinct I had as someone who cared about these animals said to intervene before they seriously hurt themselves. As evening approached on March 10th, I made the decision to remain at the facility overnight, setting up a cot in the observation room to maintain continuous monitoring of what had become a genuine emergency situation. The dolphins showed no signs of fatigue despite 4 days of intensive behavioral activity, and their distress calls continued unabated as darkness fell. I called my department head to report the situation and request additional support staff for round-the-clock observation, emphasizing that we were dealing with unprecedented animal welfare concerns that might require emergency intervention. The facility's night lighting system was adjusted to provide optimal visibility for monitoring any further stranding attempts, and emergency contact numbers for marine mammal rescue organizations were posted prominently in case immediate outside assistance became necessary. As I settled in for what I knew would be a sleepless night of vigilance, I couldn't shake the feeling that these animals were trying to warn me about something catastrophic, something their senses could detect, but mine could not. The intensity of their distress suggested they were responding to a threat of enormous magnitude, but I remained completely blind to whatever danger they perceived approaching. March 11th, 2011 began at 2:47 a.m. when I was jolted awake on my makeshift cot by what sounded like a change in the Dolphins' acoustic patterns. After 5 days of continuous distress calls, my brain had learned to monitor their vocalizations even during sleep, and something was different about the sounds coming from the main pool. I stumbled to the observation window, still groggy but immediately alert when I saw that the dolphins had finally broken their formation for the first time since March 8th. Neptune was no longer pressed against the pool wall, and Luna's piercing distress calls had diminished to occasional whistles that sounded almost relieved. I checked my watch and made detailed notes about the timing, documenting the first behavioral change that suggested decreased rather than increased agitation. The dolphins were still alert and active, but the desperate edge to their movements had softened noticeably. After days of watching them strain against their environment with terrifying intensity, seeing them swim in more relaxed patterns felt like witnessing a miracle I didn't understand. By 5:30 a.m., the change in dolphin behavior was unmistakable, and dramatic enough that I began recording detailed observations of what appeared to be a systematic reduction in stress indicators across all 6 animals. Neptune's echolocation patterns had returned to something approaching normal frequency and intensity, though still elevated compared to his pre-March 7th baseline measurements. Luna was floating calmly near the surface, her breathing patterns finally showing the deep, regular rhythm I associated with relaxed dolphins. The younger animals, Splash and Echo, had resumed some of their typical playful interactions for the first time in 5 days, though their play was subdued and brief. Marina had moved away from the group slightly, returning to her preferred solitary positioning in deeper water. Most remarkably, Cisco approached the pool edge where I stood and actually seemed to make eye contact with me, something that had been impossible during the height of their distressed behavior. I found myself crying with relief, though I still had no idea what had triggered either their initial distress or this apparent recovery. I was in the process of documenting this behavioral shift when my colleague, Dr. Peterson, burst into the observation room at 6:15 a.m. with her phone in her hand and an expression of shock that immediately sent my heart racing. "Sarah, you need to see this immediately," she said, pulling up a news app and shoving the screen toward me with shaking hands. The headline read, "Massive 9.0 earthquake strikes off Japan's coast," and below it were preliminary reports of devastating tsunami waves hitting the Pacific coastline. My first thought was professional concern for marine research facilities in Japan that I knew housed dolphins and other cetaceans. My second thought, the one that made my knees weak, was about the timing. I looked at my observation notes, then at the timestamp on the news report, then back at the pool where 6 dolphins were floating calmly for the first time since March 7th. The earthquake had occurred at 2:46 p.m. Japan Standard Time, which translated to 9:46 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on March 10th, almost exactly when I had first noticed the dolphins beginning to show signs of decreased agitation. We spent the next 2 hours glued to news coverage as reports of the tsunami's devastating impact began flooding in from across the Pacific. Waves over 130 feet high had struck Japan's coast, devastating entire cities and killing thousands of people in a matter of hours. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center was issuing alerts for coastal areas throughout the Pacific Rim, including California, though the waves reaching our coast would be significantly smaller than those that hit Japan. As we watched footage of the unimaginable destruction, I kept glancing back at the dolphins, who continued to show increasingly normal behavior patterns. Neptune had actually begun investigating food in the pool, his first feeding interest since March 9th. Luna was producing her typical morning vocalizations, rather than the distress calls that had dominated the past 5 days. The contrast between the horrific images on the news and the peaceful scene in our research pools created a cognitive dissonance that left me struggling to process what I was witnessing. The correlation between the timing of the earthquake and the change in dolphin behavior was so precise that it demanded acknowledgement, even though the scientific implications seemed impossible to accept. I reviewed my detailed observation notes from the past 5 days, marking timestamps against the earthquake's occurrence and the subsequent tsunami propagation across the Pacific. The dolphins had begun showing unusual behavior on March 7th, 4 days before the earthquake, with intensity building steadily until March 10th. Their peak distress had occurred in the hours leading up to the seismic event, and their recovery had begun almost exactly when the earthquake struck Japan. The precision of this correlation couldn't be explained by coincidence. The probability of random behavioral changes aligning so perfectly with a distant geological event was essentially zero. I found myself confronting the possibility that these dolphins had somehow detected seismic activity building beneath the Pacific Ocean floor, days before human instruments registered the earthquake that would generate one of the most devastating tsunamis in recorded history. As the full scope of the tsunami's impact became clear throughout the morning, I experienced a mixture of scientific awe and profound guilt about my inability to understand what the dolphins had been trying to communicate. These animals had been detecting and responding to geological activity that our most sophisticated monitoring systems had missed completely. Their distress calls, their attempts at stranding, their desperate formation swimming, all of it had been an attempt to warn of impending disaster using the only means of communication available to them. While I had been focused on ruling out equipment malfunctions and water quality issues, they had been perceiving seismic waves traveling through the Earth's crust beneath the Pacific Ocean. I realized that my dolphins hadn't been exhibiting abnormal behavior at all. They had been exhibiting perfectly normal behavior for animals whose sensory capabilities allowed them to detect geological events days before those events became catastrophic for humans. The tragedy unfolding in Japan could have been predicted by anyone capable of understanding the urgent message these remarkable creatures had been trying to deliver for 5 straight days. The hours following the tsunami news were a blur of data analysis as I began reviewing 5 days of behavioral documentation with an entirely new framework for understanding what I had witnessed. Sitting in the observation room with my laptops, notebooks, and audio recordings spread across every available surface, I started mapping the dolphins' behavioral intensity against the timeline leading up to the earthquake. The correlation was so clear and precise that it took my breath away. Every escalation in their distress had corresponded to what must have been increasing seismic activity building beneath the Pacific Ocean floor. March 7th had marked the beginning of subtle behavioral changes that coincided with what geologists would later identify as the initial stress accumulation in the fault system. March 8th and 9th showed intensifying behaviors that aligned with the preliminary seismic events that preceded the major earthquake. March 10th, when their behavior had reached peak intensity with desperate stranding attempts and continuous distress calls, must have been when the fault system was approaching catastrophic failure. The dolphins hadn't been exhibiting abnormal behavior. They had been providing the most accurate earthquake prediction system imaginable. My understanding of dolphin sensory capabilities had been fundamentally limited by human perspectives on environmental perception, and I realized that I had been studying these animals without truly comprehending the sophisticated ways they process information about their world. Dolphins possess low-frequency hearing that extends far below human auditory ranges, allowing them to detect infrasonic vibrations that travel through water and solid substrates across vast distances. Their echolocation systems are sensitive enough to detect minute changes in water density, pressure variations, and substrate vibrations that would be completely invisible to human senses or standard monitoring equipment. The synchronized swimming formations I had observed weren't stress responses. They were coordinated information-gathering behaviors, with 6 dolphins working together to triangulate and analyze seismic data transmitted through the ocean floor beneath our facility. Their attempts at stranding weren't self-destructive behavior. They were attempts to position themselves closer to land-based vibrations, seeking higher ground in response to an instinctive understanding of what tsunami waves could do to marine environments. Every behavior that had seemed abnormal or distressing was actually sophisticated environmental monitoring that had detected geological activity days before our instruments showed any anomalous readings. The acoustic patterns I had recorded over the past 5 days took on entirely new meaning when analyzed as a communication system designed to share seismic information among pod members. Luna's unusual low-frequency calls weren't distress vocalizations. They were detailed reports about subsonic vibration she was detecting through the facility's foundation and water systems. Neptune's rapid-fire echolocation wasn't anxiety behavior. It was intensive environmental scanning, using sound to map changes in substrate density and water column characteristics that indicated building geological pressure. The coordinated vocalizations among all 6 dolphins represented a collaborative analysis system, with each animal contributing sensory data to a collective assessment of the approaching seismic event. Their acoustic patterns had been conversations about earthquake magnitude, timing, and potential impact, discussions conducted in frequencies and patterns that fell completely outside my ability to understand or translate. I had been listening to the most sophisticated geological monitoring system on Earth. operated by animals whose sensory evolution had prepared them to detect and survive exactly these kinds of catastrophic events. Reviewing the timeline of behavioral escalation against known earthquake precursor patterns revealed that my dolphins had been detecting seismic activity with remarkable precision and well ahead of any human detection capabilities. Geological analysis after the March 11th earthquake showed that fault stress had been building for weeks before the main event, creating minute pressure changes and subsonic vibrations that propagated through the Pacific Ocean floor. The dolphins' initial behavioral changes on March 7th aligned perfectly with when this stress accumulation would have reached levels detectable by highly sensitive organisms. Their increasing agitation through March 8th and 9th correlated with the period when preliminary fault movements were generating low-frequency vibrations too subtle for seismological instruments to register as significant. The peak intensity of their distress behavior on March 10th occurred during what scientists now know were the final hours before catastrophic fault failure, when seismic precursor activity was reaching maximum intensity. The Dolphins had essentially provided a 4-day advance warning of one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded history, using sensory capabilities that evolution had refined over millions of years of survival in seismically active ocean environments. The implications of this realization extended far beyond my individual research project and forced me to confront fundamental limitations in how science approaches natural disaster prediction and animal behavior analysis. Marine mammals had evolved in environments where geological activity could generate tsunami waves capable of devastating coastal ecosystems, creating evolutionary pressure for sensory systems that could detect seismic events with enough advance warning to enable survival responses. Dolphins, whales, and other cetaceans represented living geological monitoring networks, distributed across the world's oceans and capable of detecting earthquake precursors with sensitivity that exceeded our technological capabilities. The behavioral patterns I had observed weren't unique to my research facility. They were likely occurring in marine mammal populations throughout the Pacific Rim, whenever significant seismic activity was building toward catastrophic release. Indigenous cultures around the Pacific had traditional knowledge about animal behavior changes that preceded earthquakes and tsunamis, suggesting that humans had once understood and utilized these natural warning systems before technological approaches to disaster prediction displaced traditional ecological knowledge. As I compiled my data and prepared reports for my colleagues and supervisors, I felt the weight of missed opportunity and the profound responsibility that comes with understanding how much information about natural disasters exists in the behavior of animals we typically view as research subjects rather than environmental sensors. 6 dolphins had spent 5 days trying to warn everyone within acoustic range about an approaching disaster that would kill over 15,000 people and cause unprecedented environmental damage across the Pacific. Their message had been clear, urgent, and precisely timed, but it had been delivered in a language that required understanding their sensory capabilities and evolutionary adaptations to geological activity. I began drafting communications to earthquake monitoring agencies, marine mammal research facilities, and emergency management organizations, proposing that captive and wild cetacean behavior be incorporated into seismic monitoring protocols as early warning systems for major earthquake and tsunami events. The dolphins at Scripps had demonstrated that nature provides disaster prediction capabilities far more sophisticated than our technological systems. We just needed to learn how to listen to what these remarkable animals were trying to tell us about the dynamic, dangerous planet we all share. In the weeks that followed March 11th, as I worked to document and publish findings about the dolphins' predictive behavior, I found myself grappling with questions that extended far beyond marine biology into realms of philosophy, theology, and humanity's place in the natural world. These 6 dolphins possess sensory capabilities refined over 50 million years of cetacean evolution, abilities that allowed them to perceive geological activity with precision that humbled our most advanced technological systems. But as I reflected on the intricate complexity of their warning behaviors, I began to see something more profound than evolutionary adaptation. I saw evidence of intelligent design that had embedded early warning systems throughout creation itself. The dolphins hadn't simply evolved random sensitivity to seismic activity. They had developed sophisticated, coordinated response patterns that served not just their own survival, but potentially the survival of other species willing to pay attention to their signals. Their behavior suggested that nature itself contained protective mechanisms, built-in safeguards that could help all living creatures navigate the dangers of our dynamic planet. The more I studied their responses, the more convinced I became that I had witnessed something that pointed toward a creator who had embedded care and protection throughout the fabric of creation. The precision and sophistication of what the dolphins had demonstrated forced me to reconsider fundamental assumptions about intelligence, communication, and the purpose of scientific study itself. These animals had detected, analyzed, and attempted to communicate information about a geological event with accuracy that exceeded human capabilities, using sensory systems we barely understood and social coordination we couldn't replicate technologically. Their behavior wasn't random or instinctual in any simple sense. It represented complex problem-solving, collaborative information processing, and deliberate communication attempts that suggested consciousness and intentionality far beyond what I had previously attributed to non-human species. As I reviewed hours of recordings and behavioral data, I began to see evidence of minds working together toward a common purpose, individuals contributing their unique capabilities to a collective understanding of environmental threats. The dolphins had essentially operated as a living early warning system, a biological network designed to detect and communicate about dangers that could affect entire ecosystems. This level of sophisticated coordination and apparent concern for the welfare of others suggested to me that consciousness itself might be distributed throughout creation in ways that science was only beginning to understand. My role as a researcher had suddenly become far more complex and morally significant than I had ever imagined when I first began studying dolphin behavior. I realized that I wasn't just documenting animal cognition for academic purposes. I was serving as an interpreter between species, with the responsibility to help humanity understand and respond appropriately to information that other creatures were constantly providing about our shared environment. The dolphins had entrusted me with their message about seismic activity, but I had initially lacked the wisdom to understand their communication as anything more than abnormal behavior requiring correction. This failure of interpretation had profound implications. How many other warnings had scientists dismissed as pathological behavior rather than recognizing them as vital information about environmental threats? How many opportunities to prevent disaster had been missed because we approached other species as subjects to be studied rather than as partners whose unique capabilities might complement and enhance human understanding? I began to see my scientific training not as a means to control or categorize nature, but as a tool for learning to listen more carefully to the wisdom embedded in creation itself. The theological implications of what I had witnessed challenged me to expand my understanding of how divine care might manifest through the natural systems God had created. If dolphins possessed the ability to detect earthquakes days before human instruments could register seismic activity, what other protective capabilities existed in creation that we had failed to recognize or utilize appropriately? Indigenous cultures worldwide had traditional knowledge about animal behavior changes that preceded natural disasters, suggesting that humans had once understood how to interpret nature's warning systems before modern technology displaced traditional ecological wisdom. Perhaps the separation between scientific and spiritual approaches to understanding creation had caused us to overlook the ways that divine providence might operate through the natural capabilities of living creatures rather than through supernatural intervention alone. The dolphins' behavior suggested that God had embedded protective mechanisms throughout creation itself, early warning systems operated by creatures whose sensory capabilities exceeded human limitations. Recognizing and respecting these natural warning systems might be part of humanity's responsibility as stewards of creation, called to work collaboratively with other species, rather than assuming our technological capabilities represented the pinnacle of environmental awareness. This experience fundamentally altered my approach to marine mammal research and my understanding of the proper relationship between human scientific inquiry and the rest of creation. I began developing research protocols that treated dolphins as collaborative partners in environmental monitoring, rather than as passive subjects of human investigation. My communications with earthquake monitoring agencies emphasized the need to incorporate animal behavior observations into seismic warning systems, recognizing that creatures like dolphins represented sophisticated biological sensors that could complement technological monitoring networks. I started reaching out to indigenous communities whose traditional knowledge included animal-based disaster prediction, seeking to learn from wisdom systems that had maintained connections between human communities and their natural environments across generations. The dolphins had taught me that scientific humility was essential, that our role as researchers should be to listen carefully to what creation was constantly communicating, rather than assuming human understanding represented the complete picture of environmental reality. My work became focused on building bridges between species, developing translation systems that could help humanity benefit from the environmental awareness that God had distributed throughout the living world. Looking back on those 5 days in March, I understood that I had been given a profound privilege, the opportunity to witness creation's protective systems in action, and to serve as a messenger about capabilities that existed beyond human technological achievement. The dolphins had demonstrated that divine care operates through natural systems of extraordinary sophistication, warning networks that could help prevent disasters if humanity learned to pay attention to the signals other creatures were constantly providing. Their behavior had revealed that we live in a world where protective intelligence is distributed throughout creation, where creatures possess capabilities that complement rather than compete with human understanding, and where our role as stewards involves learning to listen as much as learning to speak. My research became a form of worship, an acknowledgement that the Creator had embedded wisdom throughout the natural world that exceeded my ability to fully comprehend, but demanded my most careful attention and respect. The dolphins had shown me that science at its best serves not to control or dominate creation, but to help humanity recognize and respond appropriately to the magnificent complexity of the world God had designed. Every day in the laboratory became an opportunity to listen more carefully to what creation was teaching, and every behavioral observation became a reminder of my responsibility to serve as a faithful interpreter of the messages that other species were sharing about our shared home.